I find the history of science fascinating, particularly the formation of scientific methodology in the 18th and 19th centuries. We have pretty established traditions now with rigid expectations and high standards. Back then they hadn't yet imposed all of that. Historic pioneers in some fields who are celebrated now wouldn't meet our minimum criteria if they applied today. So it's hard to imagine when the rules were different or when there were few, if any, required procedures or credentials at all. Even leading naturalists, as they were called back then, often had accolades with no credentials. What made them scientists was whether they did science, and that practice was different too. And nowadays, scientists are typically expected to be on a university-funded project led by a PhD, publishing studies and experiments to peer review as per protocol. The peer review process wasn't introduced until the 1700s, but it wasn't consistently implemented until the mid-20th century. Darwin had no science degrees, no team, no grants. He did the work on his own and published a book about it in the popular press. That's how it worked back then, and a lot of other people did the same, whether we would respect their science today or not. What I find particularly fascinating is reading the thoughts of pioneer thinkers of the 19th century. It's not just that some of the terms were different or defined differently, it's that what are now well understood concepts were amorphous enigmas back then. We have strongly supported models. They didn't. They were still trying to figure it out. How well would we do if we grew up with them knowing no more than they did? What seems so obvious to us now was a complete mystery to them. And that's what makes reading their work so interesting. That and evaluating the cultural influences of the society at the time. Even the most respected scientists of that era had ideas that they thought were reasonable, but that sounded laughably absurd to us. There's an awful lot I could say about that, but I must remain focused on the topic for today. German physician Rudolf Virchow, the father of pathology, developed cell theory, the idea that the cell is the basis of life. And yes, it is still a theory, because it has never been proven and never will be. Virchow believed that all cells come from cells, the law of biogenesis, which is a fair assessment. He also said that all diseased cells come from diseased cells. Logical, I guess. But if someone is healthy all their life and develops a malady in their senior years, then it stands to reason that diseased cells came from a first diseased cell that hadn't always already been diseased, that had become diseased and was originally healthy. Realizing this, Virchow then re-examined the law of biogenesis, realizing that if cells come from living cells, there had to be a first cell that became alive somehow. And Virchow estimated that this could only happen if the protocell came from a prior matrix of cumulative aspects produced in a series of overlapping processes that he called abiogenesis, which of course countered the law of biogenesis that had originally been coined by Louis Pasteur. You got to remember that laws are made up by people, and only when they're very careful to do it right will it be accurate. And one of Virchow's medical assistants was another German physician named Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel famously invented a law too, the Biogenetic law. Biogenesis, abiogenesis, biogenetic, sign of the times, I suppose. Now, Haeckel's biogenetic law was also known as recapitulation theory, because back then a law and a theory were apparently the same thing, much like Newton's law and or theory of gravity, I suppose. Although he once worked with and for Rudolf Virchow, Haeckel was not a cell biologist. He was a zoologist, familiar with taxonomic classifications and biodiversity. So of course he was fascinated by Darwin's then recent publication of evolution by natural selection. Haeckel studied embryos of different animals at different stages of development, and he got the impression that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning that as a mammalian embryo develops, it passes through stages of its evolutionary ancestry, which at that time were very simplistically thought to be divided into what are now antiquated notions of fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Haeckel was a talented artist, and one of his many illustrations, this one being the Tree of Life, also illustrates, if you read the labels, how they had very different ideas of taxonomic categories back then. Oddly enough, Ernst Haeckel accepted evolution while Rudolf Virchow did not. And the reason that's odd is that Haeckel was then an evangelical Christian while Virchow was an atheist, which was rare at the time, especially with no accepted explanation of biodiversity. Where did you think everything came from? Yet these former associates had a falling out over this, because back then there weren't many transitional species yet known, and Virchow thought there never would be, that predicted intermediates were nothing more than a dream. Virchow said that Haeckel was a fool for believing in transmutations. Despite this, Haeckel went on to become famous as an award-winning science communicator, receiving both the Darwin-Wallace Medal and the Gold Medal of the Linnaean Society. Jealous? How does one get nominated for one of these? Anyway, Haeckel was like the science guy of his day. For example, this is Mount Haeckel, nestled between Mount Darwin and Mount Wallace in California, just south of Mount Mendel. But Mount Haeckel overlooks the evolution basin. And there's another Mount Haeckel in New Zealand. That's how well respected this guy was in his time. But as a leading proponent of evolution, Ernst Haeckel caught a lot of flack from the religious organizations of his day, as well as from Rudolf Virchow, who remained an outspoken critic to the end of his life. Virchow once accused Haeckel of deception. Haeckel was reportedly charged with fraud by his university, but there's no evidence that that actually happened beyond Virchow's accusation, which Haeckel addressed in the common public media, so it seems he wasn't tried for fraud after all. However, Haeckel's once celebrated reputation is tarnished today, and there are three reasons for that. One is that his biogenetic law, or theory of recapitulation, was perilously similar to one of Carl Ernst von Baer's laws of embryology, the difference being that Haeckel proposed that a mammal embryo actually becomes a fish, then an amphibian, then a reptile, before becoming a mammal. Where von Baer said that the embryo of the higher animal form never resembles the adult of another animal form, such as one less evolved, but only its embryo. That embryological relationship is important. That's what develops the science of evo-devo. Now, of course, we don't describe organisms as higher or lower anymore, and it doesn't make sense to describe anything as less evolved. But otherwise, von Baer's laws of embryology are better supported and refute Haeckel's law. That may not seem like a big deal, but if you publish a law or a theory and it later gets overturned, that'll cost you credibility. Look at George Stahl. He proposed the theory of vitalism and the theory of phlogiston, and they were both disproved. So modern scientists look at George Stahl and shake their heads and roll their eyes, and they give that very dismissive one-ha laugh. There goes your historic legacy. Had Haeckel only referred to his recapitulation as a hypothesis, he'd have fared much better. And if he hadn't specified that he meant the adult stages, or that a mammalian embryo actually becomes a fish rather than becoming very similar to the development of a fish at that stage, then the poetic sounding phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny might be accepted as accurate today. It's a matter of discipline, and that's what got Haeckel into trouble. Because he was a talented artist, and camera technology was very limited then, he drew accurate comparisons of the embryos of several different species, showing sufficient homology to qualify as evidence of evolution. He really did. That's why our current science textbooks show microphotographs of the same similarities that he saw. The problem was that he had a deadline to meet with the publisher, and he didn't think he had enough time to sit at the microscope and carefully draw all the embryos he needed before then. So for the first edition of his book, and only for that first edition, he used the same drawing for 2 or 3 of those embryos, wherein later editions included all original artwork for everything as it should be. When a reviewer of that first edition noticed that the drawing for human embryos and the one for dog embryos were in fact the very same drawing duplicated, Haeckel said that that didn't matter because both of those embryos looked so much alike at that stage. It might have seemed pointless to him to draw the exact same thing again, because he was right, they do look very similar. If you compare the developmental stages rather than calendar days, then they are quite similar, especially if the best technology you have is a microscope from the 1860s. So at that time, it might have seemed to Haeckel as if this was just a harmless and defensible fib, something anyone would understand and forgive, and that it wouldn't make any difference anyway. Even so, as trivial as it was still a lie, and it cost him his credibility forever. Not just ruining his career or his reputation for the rest of his life, but leaving him vulnerable to further criticism in the next century, too. More than 80 years after Haeckel died, the accuracy of his drawings was challenged, and he was posthumously accused of bias, as if he had tried to enhance certain features to make them look more similar than they really were. Of course, creationists crow about this, as they do about anything else that called his accurate observations into question. But this time, it turned out that the people making these accusations used sloppy methods of photography that actually made those embryos look more different than they really were, which is ironic because they did this while accusing Haeckel of having done the exact same thing but leaning in the other direction. The damning photographs published by Michael Robertson in 1997 showed embryos with yolk and other maternal material, and they were photographed at different angles and at different sizes, which of course made them look very different. Haeckel clearly indicated that his drawings were only of embryos, omitting things like yolk, and that he made them all the same size and oriented the same way for ease of comparison. So there's no foul to fault here, at least not in this instance. The moral of this story is that Haeckel's ambitious assertion of a biogenetic law or of a theory of recapitulation could have been saved had it been more modestly proposed as a hypothesis to be modified. And he would have a lot more defenders of his honor against the more recent accusation of bias, too, had it not been for that one little fib that he perhaps naively but definitely mistakenly thought wouldn't be that big a deal anyway.